Latz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to note that I think it was highly unusual for Senator Ingebrigtsen to inquire of a witness about whether or not they're being paid to be here. I mean, if that's a relevant consideration, we should ask every witness when they come up here to disclose their salary and the source of their salary. Ms. Bauer, I'm sure, was paid by MCCL. Part of her job is to be here testifying today. Dr. Collette, I'm sure, is either she's being paid as a professor, and some of what she does as a professor is go around and testify to things, or else she'd give exactly the same disclaimer that Dr. Schultz gave in his testimony. She's here only in her personal capacity, and her affiliations are only meant to inform us as to her credibility.
Senator Latz, Professor Collette did make a disclaimer of that when she made her comments.
As did Dr. Schultz at the very end of his testimony. So for any follow-up inquiry about sources of compensation, whether being paid to be here, I think is inappropriate. We ought to be cautious whether we do that to all of our witnesses. Mr. Chairman, secondly, I have a question for Professor Schultz, since there was an issue raised, and in fact by Senator Thompson at the very beginning, about how we have to be cautious when we are paying for public goods that don't benefit or that may benefit particular individuals. And he raised that issue, suggesting that paying for abortion services would have a benefit for particular individuals and wouldn't necessarily be a public good. And I wonder whether there's any constitutional issues, since we also pay for health care for thousands of Minnesotans. And every time that health care is delivered to an individual, clearly it has a benefit to that individual's health. I also I have a question relating to what Dr. Schultz raised in terms of activist judges. He didn't use the term activist judge, but that's essentially what he's saying, is that this legislation is a call for the Minnesota Supreme Court to become activist judges. And I think the irony here is that just several days ago we had hours of testimony on an amendment to the Minnesota Constitution over the definition of marriage. And the whole purpose of that, as stated by the witnesses over and over again, was to stay away from the courts because the courts are going to be so activist that they might actually impose their own views rather than a constitutional analysis. And here we have the testimony saying, we want activist judges. Essentially, that's what they're saying, because we have 15 years of precedent in Minnesota. And to overturn that precedent would necessarily be a radical change. Now, the membership of the court has changed a bit, and they certainly wouldn't characterize themselves as activists, but any major overturning of precedent would basically be judges not hewing to precedent, but rather being activist.